Today, England presents a face of global stability. This is the political and cultural center of what was once history's largest empire, defined by naval dominance and an entrenched parliamentary system. But that reputation hides an earlier reality. For the first 1,000 years of its history, England was a prime target for foreign powers, subjected to a continuous cycle of hostile invasions. Originally, the British Isles weren't islands. Prehistoric Britain was tethered directly to the European mainland by a physical land bridge called Doggerland. 11,000 years ago, melting ice sheets raised sea levels and submerged that connection, physically isolating the nation from the continent. Even so, the water didn't stop the flow of people or ideas. Successive migrations introduced farming practices from the Middle East and led to the construction of ceremonial stone circles like Stonehenge.
This raises a question. How did a geographically vulnerable piece of land, repeatedly seized by outsiders, eventually become the architect of the modern world? Recorded history here begins with a takeover. In 43 AD, the Roman Empire, the uncontested superpower of the ancient world, launched a planned invasion to bring the island under its rule. Roman legions advanced across the territory for decades. They built the first major cities, like London and York, and fixed their northernmost border with the construction of Hadrian's Wall. When Roman influence faded in the 5th century, the legions withdrew to defend the continent. Germanic tribes, known as the Anglo-Saxons, moved into the vacuum, replacing the local culture with their own customs and language. The Anglo-Saxons soon faced a new threat. In the late 8th century, Scandinavian Vikings began arriving. Their strategy eventually shifted from seasonal raids to total territorial conquest. The Viking advance nearly erased the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It took a desperate stand by King Alfred the Great to drive them back, an effort that allowed his descendants to unify the land into a single English state. That unified state was shattered in 1066. The Norman conquest erased the Anglo-Saxon noble line and replaced it with a French-speaking aristocracy, a change that permanently altered the nation's governance. By the end of the 11th century, the era of external invasions concluded. However, England's genetic and cultural path was now inextricably linked to the European continent. With the borders secure from foreign armies, the struggle for control migrated from the shoreline to the throne room. English barons began resisting the absolute authority of the crown. In 1215, this friction forced the king to accept the Magna Carta, a legal framework that placed the first formal limits on royal power. Dynastic rivalries eventually culminated in the Wars of the Roses. This 30-year civil conflict decimated the old nobility and allowed the Tudor Dynasty to seize power. King Henry VIII changed the national identity further when he broke away from the Catholic Church to secure a divorce. This decision triggered a century of religious violence and sectarianism. Queen Elizabeth I provided a stabilizing force during her long reign. She centralized the state administration and built a maritime defense capable of protecting the island from Spanish invasion. The 17th century saw the final violent phase of state building. A civil war between the king and parliament led to the execution of Charles I, and eventually a revolution that made parliament the supreme authority. This internal struggle stripped away the instability of absolute monarchy. It forged a politically unified nation-state capable of projecting its energy outward. By the 18th century, a stable parliament allowed the Hanoverian kings to focus the nation's resources on global trade and colonial expansion. The Industrial Revolution accelerated this growth. New technology enabled a volume of production that allowed England to dominate global markets. This industrial wealth funded the Royal Navy. With advanced warships patrolling every major trade route, Britain secured absolute supremacy on the high seas. Naval dominance led to a massive 19th century expansion. Britain established the largest territorial empire in human history, covering nearly a quarter of the world's land. The historical pendulum had fully reversed. The small, repeatedly invaded island had transformed into a global conqueror. In the 20th century, the scale of that empire met its limit. 2 world wars forced the nation to spend its wealth and manpower to the point of exhaustion. The devastation of these conflicts effectively bankrupted the nation. By the mid-1900s, British global dominance began to dissolve as its colonies sought independence. As the territory shrunk, England returned to its original geographic state, a single nation on an island off the coast of Europe. Despite the collapse of its physical borders, England's most durable export exists only in the air, the English language. The language is a living museum of the island's history.
It utilizes a Latin infrastructure, Anglo-Saxon Germanic nouns, Viking Old Norse verbs, and French aristocratic terminology, all blended into a single system. England shaped the modern world because it was first shaped by the world. Its persistence came from a unique capacity to absorb and unify the very cultures that once arrived as invaders.